Welcome back to The Explainer. I'm really glad you're here today. We tackle a lot of complex, fascinating topics on this show, but today we've got something uniquely profound to look at. We're going to dive deep into a clinical case study of a 14-year-old's breaking point. We're going to literally map out the anatomy of an absolute psychological and systemic failure. It's a true, deeply personal account of a child pushed right to the very edge, the mechanics of the environment that actually got him there, and importantly, the pathways to recovery. Beautiful, star-like cracks. Now that sounds almost poetic, doesn't it? But these cracks definitely weren't art. They were left on the acrylic plate of a family's front door mailbox. And they brilliantly illustrate the very real physical danger present inside this home. You see, those cracks were created by high-powered air guns that were handed directly to a child. Right off the bat, this establishes a pretty chilling visual motif for our analysis. The environment this kid inhabited was fractured, both literally and figuratively. So, to figure out how we got here, here is our roadmap. We'll look at the 14-year-old's breaking point, break down the dysfunctional family system, examine the pre-2006 toy gun regulations, track his psychological collapse, and finally, discuss pathways to adult recovery. Okay, Section 1, a 14-year-old's breaking point. The central incident we're talking about involved a boy opening fire at his middle school with a gas gun, but the warning signs started way before that day.
Yeah, long before the actual incident, teachers knew something was fundamentally wrong. The boy's abnormal behavior was just glaringly obvious at school. It got to the point where his homeroom teacher was making weekly visits to his house, absolutely desperate to intervene. But whenever the teacher showed up, the boy would suddenly flip a switch and display this bizarrely compliant behavior. Without even being asked, he'd politely serve tea and traditional Japanese sweets. In clinical psychology, this is known as the false self. It's a defensive, over-adapted psychological facade that a person uses just to survive a highly abnormal environment. The teacher immediately picked up on this terrifying disconnect between the severe issues happening at school and this perfectly tailored, almost robotic politeness at home. It was a massive red flag.
Moving to Section 2, the dysfunctional family system. To understand why a kid would need such an extreme defensive mask, we really have to look at what was going on in that household. You've got this profound contrast going on. On one hand, you have the father. He's this rigid authority figure who is completely detached from any sort of emotional communication. He just flat out refused to listen. Then, on the other hand, you have the mother. She acted as a superficial peacekeeper, basically operating on a policy of sweeping every problem under the rug just to keep up the illusion of harmony. Plus, she was inappropriately and excessively attached to the boy's disabled younger sibling. So, stuck between these two extremes, this 14-year-old was left entirely invisible. He effectively became the family scapegoat. By refusing to acknowledge reality, his parents essentially built a fortress that blocked any outside help from getting in. The source text actually uses a really striking pop culture analogy from Attack on Titan, Erwin Smith and the False Kings. If you're familiar with the show, false kings are these puppet rulers who hold on to authority purely for self-preservation. They maintain these fake, peaceful illusions while completely neglecting their actual duty to protect their people. And honestly, it perfectly describes these parents. They were hyper-focused on maintaining a fake, peaceful exterior, like a false monarchy of household order, while completely abandoning their basic duty to nurture and protect their own kid. For the boy, shattering that false authority became a desperate necessity just to prove he existed. Section 3, pre-2006 toy gun regulations. Let's look at what happens when you introduce unregulated physical danger into the mix. So, we are talking about a mid-Heisei era home environment. That's roughly the early to mid-2000s in Japan. Inside this emotionally void, incredibly stressful house, this kid had easy access to weapons literally meant for hunting bears, like heavy crossbows. He was handed heavily modified, tuned-up sniper rifles that were actually taller than he was. And they were just given to him. No oversight, no parental guidance, nothing. Giving a child totally unrestricted access to that kind of physical danger is way beyond irresponsible. The clinical analysis actually frames it as a profound form of neglect that practically weaponized the boy's internal trauma. To put that into perspective, you have to understand the regulatory environment back then. Before the 2006 legal revisions in Japan, the toy gun industry pretty much just relied on voluntary limits. There were zero strict legal bounds. That meant extreme modifications like swapping in metal parts to massively boost firing power were super common and totally legal. It wasn't until after 2006 that strict, legally enforced limits were applied, bringing immediate penalties for possessing anything over 0.989 joules. Because those legal guardrails simply didn't exist during this kid's childhood, those star-like cracks on the mailbox were allowed to escalate, unchecked, until they culminated in an incident involving 50 victims. The physical environment literally enabled the psychological break.
Section 4. Psychological collapse and dissociation.
Let's trace the timeline immediately following the terrifying events at the school, because the psychological deterioration was incredibly rapid. First, you have the school incident itself. Second, the apologies. The parents dragged the boy to apologize to the victims, but while he was kneeling down in a traditional apology, his father repeatedly beat him on the back of the head. It was so bad the victims' families actually had to beg him to stop. This wasn't discipline, right? It was highly performative, ritualistic abuse, basically saying, "Look at me, I am doing my job as a parent." Third, the victim's parents understandably demanded total separation and rejected the boy. That absolute rejection, layered on top of the father's performative abuse, triggered the final stage: total manic dissociation and self-harm. Consumed by insomnia, rejection, and this immense psychological pain, which he actually described as feeling like a literal knife in the chest from severe attachment trauma, the boy just fled. As he ran, with his teacher chasing him, he smashed something like 20 glass windows, all while laughing. He later said he remembered thinking, "If I'm caught, my parents will beat me to death anyway, might as well do what I want." During this frantic escape, he actually resorted to stabbing himself in the stomach and neck with a butter knife he had on him. This is a textbook pure dissociative state. It's this incredibly tragic survival strategy where the mind just completely unplugs from an unbearable reality.
And that survival strategy sets up the absolute climax of his psychological break, which comes down to a concept called the double bind. A double bind is basically an emotionally distressing dilemma where you receive completely conflicting messages, which makes absolutely any response a failed one. You're just damned if you do and damned if you don't. Watch how this plays out. After the boy was finally tackled and detained, his father didn't yell. Instead, he just broke down and asked, "What did we do wrong in raising you?" And the 14-year-old boy's internal response was simply, "How should I know?" It is such a brilliant, heartbreaking illustration of the ultimate double bind. The very adults who built this broken, abusive system were suddenly demanding that their traumatized child analyze it and fix it for them. It's a complete abdication of parental responsibility, dumping the entire emotional burden right onto the victim.
Section 5. Pathways to Adult Recovery. The storm of violence did eventually pass, but the trauma certainly didn't.
The adult survivor in this specific case study was left dealing with complex PTSD, severe depression, and a heavy reliance on self-medication, often drinking to the point of passing out just to numb everything. But clinical recovery is actually possible. The key, as our source outlines, is completely defecting from the false kings of that family system and plugging into a safe therapeutic community. There are very real, actionable resources out there. Mental health centers offer public trauma counseling. ACA, or Adult Children Anonymous, runs international 12-step groups designed specifically for people raised in dysfunctional homes. And ACODIA provides targeted support for those dealing with deep abandonment anxiety. True healing requires moving out of isolation and finding a space where being vulnerable is actually safe.
And that brings us to the end of today's analysis. The journey from a deeply fractured childhood to a stabilized adult life is just massive. It means leaving the false kingdoms that hurt us and seeking out our true selves through community and professional help. So I want to leave you all with one final lingering thought today. Once we recognize the false kings in our own systems, how do we begin the hard work of reclaiming our true selves from the ruins? Thank you so much for joining me today on The Explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and please take care of yourselves.